In this tutorial, I'll be showing you how to use the Monarch Flyin location. What this does is it makes a little box fly in from the bottom corner of your page and asks them to share. And you can trigger this fly in based on various different triggers, all of which are customizable within the Monarch Settings panel. So before we get into all of the fly in settings, let me just show you what the fly in is. So as you can see, I want to post here, and as I scroll down the post, a little fly in comes here, it's a little box with sharing buttons and a message. So now, before you can use the fly in, you first have to enable the fly in location. So to do that, go to Tools, Monarch Settings, and the first page you'll be greeted with here is your location management page. So you want to go over to the fly in location and click that, and you can see once it's enabled, you get a little green check mark, and the fly in has now been enabled. So after it's been enabled, you can configure the fly in by going over to the fly in tab here, which will give you all the settings related to the fly in location. So we have a bunch of settings here. We have the icon style, shape. You can adjust the title and the message that appears. You can choose the location, left or right. You can adjust various design settings such as the icon alignment and the number of columns, the animation. Next up, we have our triggers, which adjusts what user action will trigger the pop-up, whether it be automatic or at the bottom of the post after commenting, etc. And then moving down, we have custom color settings, and then the post type settings, which controls where that fly in will appear on your website on a post type basis. So you could have it only display on pages, only display on your home page, only display on posts, or only display on any post type you have, such as custom post types that come in plugins such as WooCommerce and the product post type, or Divi and the project post type. Okay, so let's adjust a couple of these settings and I'll show you what they do on the demo here. So first up is our icon style, which adjusts the hover animation of the buttons within the fly-in. So you can actually preview the different animation styles just by hovering over each of these. And so I have this nice flip animation selected. Next up is our icon shape. You can choose between rectangle, rounded rectangle, or circle. So I'm going to change to circle just to show you what that looks like. And next up is the title and the message. And you can adjust the title and the message that appears above the button. So right now it says tell your friends, but you could change that to please share our post. And if you don't want to use a title or message, you can just delete it. So let's say I want a title and no message below it. Just delete the title text in the input field here and then save, and it'll just disappear. So I'm saving those changes, and then we're going to take a look here. I'm going to refresh the page and trigger the fly-in, so you can see the text below the title has been erased because I deleted it, and then the title itself has been changed, the text of the title, and the buttons have been changed to a circle instead of the rounded rectangle. So those are just a couple of the settings you can play around with to start. Heading back to our settings page, I'm going to change back to my rounded rectangle shape. I'm going to put a message in here. And then we're going to move on to the display settings. So the first display setting is the location of the fly-in itself, whether it be either on the bottom right of your page or the bottom left of your page. It's up to you. So right now it's on the right, but I could change it to the left. And the next is the icon alignment, which can either be left or centered. This will adjust the location of the icon within each button. So if you were paying attention to the demo I just showed you, the icon was on the left, but if you want to have it centered, which will center the icon and the title of the network as well as the share count, you can do that. So I can change this to centered, and I'll show you what that looks like. Next up is the number of columns. So you can adjust the grid of buttons that appears within the fly-in. So you can have either one column, which will stack them all the buttons on top of each other, or you can have two columns, which will put two buttons side by side, or three. And yeah, it really depends how many buttons you're trying to put in there. So the less buttons you have, the more liberties you have with how small your column structure is. So let's say you had 20 buttons and you chose one column. Those are going to stack up pretty high. I might get a little weird looking. So it's really up to you. We give you the ability to control that on your own, so you can make that decision. But I'll change it to 1 just to show you what that looks like. Okay, so refreshing, I have changed it over to the left here, and I've changed the icon setting alignment to centered. I have changed the column structure to one column, and as you can see, what I was saying here, because we have so many buttons enabled, that one column structure really creates a pretty tall fly-in. So I would advise only to use that when you just have a few buttons. So it's pretty common to only use the most popular sharing buttons, which are Facebook, Twitter, and Google+. So if you only have those 3 buttons enabled, then the one column structure actually looks much nicer than using a 2 column structure, because not only because it fills out the fly-in more, but also because 3 buttons in a 2 column structure will result in an empty space on the 4th column, or the 4th field of the column. And one more thing you can mention is that the centered icon style, which results in a stacking of the icon and the text. So when you stack the icon and the text and keep everything centered, it's going to naturally make the button bigger. So using the centered location, the centered alignment of the icons results in larger buttons. So again, this is I would suggest using this when you have fewer buttons enabled. So you can kind of play with those settings with the columns and the icon alignment to adjust how big the buttons are and how big that fly-in appears. So just to give you an example, I'm going to keep the one column structure the same, but then I'm going to change the icon alignment to left, which will actually result in a smaller button, and it'll make this fly-in look a little bit less aggressive with these 6 sharing locations enabled, or six networks enabled. So change the icon alignment back to left and save, and you can see that these buttons will get a lot smaller once everything's not stacked. So you can see that's a much better result in this case when we're using one column and 6 sharing profiles. Okay, heading back. One other thing about the column structure is that there's a 4th option, which is auto width. So the auto width won't confine your buttons to any particular column width. They will only be as big as they need to be to house the content within them. So what that means is they're just going to be as big as they need to be to fit the icon and the title of the network. So the button's going to get bigger for networks with bigger names and so on. But if you're trying to squish a lot of buttons in to the fly-in using auto width and then disabling network names and network counts will result in these like nice little square buttons. So just to give you an example, let's say I want to fit a lot more networks in here. I can enable auto width, and then I can disable network names, and you can see this is going to result in just these little small square buttons here. So like I said, auto width doesn't force them to be any specific column structure. It's not forcing them to be 50% width, let's say, with a 2 column structure. They're just as big as they need to be to house, in this case, the icon by itself, which results in nice small buttons. Okay. Going back, I'm going to switch back to a 2 column structure. And next up is the intro animation. So this is the animation that occurs when the fly-in appears. So by default, I just have it as fade in, but you can either disable the animation by choosing no animation, or you can choose from one of our many other animations, such as slide up from the bottom, slide in from the left or right, or some of these more crazy ones like a swinging animation or a bounce animation or a flip. So let's change it to flip. This is one of those animations that will definitely grab your visitor's attention. So scrolling down, you can kind of see it flips in and anchors, which is a pretty cool effect. Next up are the triggers. So this is where you can really control who gets shown the fly-in and what actions they take to trigger that fly-in. So one of the most basic triggers is the time delay. So this will just automatically show that fly-in to everybody who has been on your page for a certain amount of time. So if you enable this, you can get a second option, which is the delay in seconds that you want to use. So I've enabled trigger after time delay, and I've input a time of 5 seconds, which means that anyone who's on a page for 5 seconds will get shown the fly-in. So this is great to only hit users who are like engaged with the post. You know, let's say they've been reading. If they've been on your page for more than 5 seconds, they're obviously at least a little bit interested. And if they've been on your page even longer, they're even more interested. So you can kind of play with that range. You know, when do you think is the best time to ask the visitor to share? And you can experiment that with yourself. I would say generally you want to use something more like 20 seconds, but it's really up to you. And I'm going to keep it at 5 for now, just so I can show you and I don't have to wait so long. So I'm going to enable the time delay. It's set to 5 seconds, and if I refresh the page and kind of just sit here for 5 seconds, you'll see that the Flyin will appear. And there you go. Okay, moving on to the next trigger. Trigger after inactivity. So this works just like the time delay, but that time countdown only comes into effect when the user has been inactive. So let's say they have read your post and they opened a new tab and went to some other site, and they kind of forgot about your page, and they go to get lunch and they come back and they open up your tab again, and instead of just closing the tab and going, oh yeah, I've seen this before, now you've greeted them with a new action for them to follow. So it's a way to kind of recapture the attention of people who you may have lost otherwise. So like I said, if someone leaves your page for a certain amount of time, so you can enable this trigger and then adjust the idle timeout. So in this case, I'm going to change it to 5 seconds again and save, and you can see that if I'm reading the post and this is enabled, I'm not going to get hit with a pop-up while I'm active, but if I go inactive and I stop moving around for a little while, in this case 5 seconds, that Flyin is going to appear. There you go. Next up is the trigger at the bottom of post. So this is one of my favorite triggers because it only targets visitors who are engaged with your post and therefore are most likely to share with your post. So in this case, it only pops up when someone has read through your entire page and finished reading your page. So obviously they enjoyed it if they finished reading it. So I'm going to enable the trigger at the bottom of post and show you that. Refresh here. So I'm reading, I scroll down, and once I hit to the bottom, I get asked to share. So this is a great way to not, risk annoying all of your visitors and then only engaging with those who have enjoyed your content and are likely to share it. Next up is the trigger after commenting. So this also targets your most engaged users. In fact, it targets perhaps your absolutely your most engaged users, which are those who have interacted with your post. So they've read your post, they've enjoyed the post so much that they've decided to comment on the post. And so now they're very invested in the post and they're very likely to share it. So this simply asks them to share after they've commented on it. So I'm going to enable this. I'm going to go to the post and then scroll down. So in this case, I'm not getting greeted with the pop-up after any kind of delay. I'm only going to get greeted with the pop-up once I've commented. So this was a great post. And then I'm going to get the Flyin, as you see. So this only targets visitors who have commented on your post and enjoyed the post. It's a really great way to get more shares. So I would suggest enabling that. And you can use these triggers in conjunction with each other. So it's not like a one-size-fits-all type thing. So you can, let's say you want to trigger after inactivity to get the visitors who you think have been lost and gone idle. And so you're targeting kind of like in a way, your least engaged visitors and trying to capture them. And at the same time, you've enabled trigger after commenting and you're engaging with your most engaged visitors. You're kind of hitting both ends of the spectrum. So you can actually enable all these at once. And it won't be too annoying because you only see the Flyin once per page view. So it's not like each of these triggers is going to keep triggering the Flyin over and over again as they scroll down the page. You can actually enable all of these and kind of pick and choose which ones you think are most effective for your audience. Okay, next up is the trigger after scrolling. So this is very similar to the trigger at bottom of the post, which in that case, when they scroll to the bottom of the post is triggered. But in this case, the trigger after scrolling trigger lets you decide exactly when and how much they have to scroll before the Flyin appears. So if for whatever reason you want to say, hit people 50% down the page, depending on your content, that might actually be more effective than 100% down the page. Maybe you want to get them right in the beginning. It's really up to you. So if you want to have a bit more granular control about where that Flyin appears, at what percentage down the page it appears, then you can enable this trigger. And once you enable the trigger, you're going to get a % down the page option. So you can choose at what % down the page the visitor is shown the Flyin. So by default, it's set to 50 here. I'm just going to keep it there to show you what it does. So I'm going to refresh the page and then scroll 50% down the page, and you can see the Flyin is shown. Next up is the trigger after purchasing. So this is much like the trigger after commenting. It only displays the sharing Flyin after the user has partaken in a very specific action, in this case, purchasing a product through WooCommerce. And right now we just support WooCommerce, but we may support more systems in the future, and if we do, you'll see a note about that below the video. So in this case, if someone has visited your page, they love your brand, they love your product so much that they purchase the product, they're actually probably most likely to share, more likely to share than any other visitor, because they're so engaged. In fact, they may be a big fan of yours. So in this case, once they've gone through the checkout process and they purchase the product, on the success page, you're going to get the Flyin. It's going to ask them to share how much they love your brand and how much they love your product. So if you want to, if you're selling products through WooCommerce, I would highly suggest that. And again, it's only targeting your most engaged visitors, which means you're not annoying the passerbyers. Next up is the display once per session option. What this does is it limits the amount of times that Flyin will appear per visitor session. So let's say you have the Flyin enabled in all your posts, and you're worried that visitors who are very engaged and going from post to post and reading a lot of your posts, you're worried that they're going to get annoyed with all the Flyins that are appearing over and over again, and you only want them to see one Flyin per session. So when you enable this, the Flyin will only appear once per session that you can adjust here. So you adjust the session duration. Let's say it's 1 day. The visitor is only going to be shown one Flyin per day, no matter how many pages they visit. And when they come back the next day, they'll get to see another Flyin. And you can adjust that to how many ever days you like. Next up, we have the share counts option, which allows you to either enable or disable the share counts, which is a count of how many times your page has been shared on each network, and that appears within each sharing button. So if I enable display share counts and I click save, you're going to see that the Flyin now has a bunch of zeros here in each button, and that's because my post has never been shared before. I'm just using this test installation on my local host, but in your case you probably have a few shares, and so the amount of shares on each network will appear within each button here. Now, speaking of zero share counts, if you don't want to have a bunch of zeros being displayed on your page, well, then we have a setting for that as well. So if you notice when you enable the display share counts option, so I'm going to disable and then enable it one more time, you'll see that this second option called minimum count display appears, and this is where you can adjust the minimum count threshold, which is the minimum amount of shares that must be reached in any individual network before a share count is displayed. So let's say you only want to display a share count when your post has been shared at least 10 times within any specific network. You can put 10 here, and let's say you had 10 shares on Facebook, 20 shares on Google+, and zero shares on Twitter. Well, you're going to get a 10 and 20, and instead of a 0, for Twitter, you're just going to have no share counts displayed there. So in my case, if I enabled 10, since I have all zeros, then all my counts are going to be gone here, which I think is actually a better effect than having a bunch of zeros. I think it's more enticing to your visitors to see no share count if that share count happens to be 0, because the 0 might actually deter people from sharing. So this is a good option to have enabled, and I'd probably have it set to at least 1. Okay, next up is the display total shares option. And this will tally up all the shares you have and create a total share count above the buttons. So if I enable this, well, in my case, since 0 times 6 is still 0, I'm going to get a 0 shares here, but you can see this is where the tally appears right above the buttons. And if I had 10 shares on Facebook and 30 on Twitter and 40 on Google, well, I'd have an 80 up here, 80 total shares. Next up is the display network names, and this is going to display the name of the network to the right of the icon and to the left of the share count. So I'm going to enable that and show you what that looks like. As you can see here, we have the name of the network, Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, Google. And so if you want to enable those, you can. Finally, we have the Display All Networks button. What this will do is add a new button next to all the other buttons, which when clicked will give users the option to share on any network that Monarch supports. And so if you want to allow people to share anywhere, but you don't want to clutter your Flyin with 30 different buttons, well, you can enable the All Networks button, and that'll still give people the opportunity to share anywhere without cluttering your page up. So just an example. So let's say under my networks here, I only want to display these 5 networks, but I still want people to be able to share anywhere and not be limited by those networks. But I've decided, well, these are the most popular ones, so I'll display those. And in addition, I'll still put the All Networks button below that. So back to our Flyin settings, if I enable the All Networks button and refresh the page here, you'll see that a new button is displayed after all the rest of the buttons, and when this is clicked, you'll get a pop-up that displays all the networks, and your users can share anywhere they like. Next is the remove icon spacing. So when the icon spacing has been removed, then all the buttons will become kind of one colorful block. It's purely a design decision, so it's up to you which style you like better, but just to show you what this looks like, I'm going to enable that option and refresh the page, and you'll notice that between each button, the spaces have been removed, creating this kind of multicolored block appearance, which is a cool effect, and if you happen to like it, then you can enable that option. Finally, we have the Hide on Mobile Devices option. What this will do is hide the Flyin if someone's visiting your site on their mobile phone. So in many cases, you might have multiple sharing locations enabled. You might have a pop-up, a Flyin, and that floating social sidebar. And while that's not too overbearing on a desktop, you know, it might be okay to have that floating sidebar, and as you reach the bottom of the post, a second Flyin comes in to give your visitors that extra nudge. Well, on the phone, there's much less real estate, and you might not want to have all those locations enabled. In fact, I recommend only having the floating sidebar enabled on mobile and having the rest appear only on desktop. So in this case, since it's the Flyin, I would recommend disabling it on mobile devices if you also have the floating sidebar enabled, for example. And like I said, when this is enabled, that Flyin will appear on your desktop computer, but will not appear on a mobile device such as a smartphone. Next up, we have our color settings, and this allows you to override the default colors with your own custom colors. So by default, we use the colors that best represent the brand colors of each network. So Facebook will be blue, Twitter will be a lighter blue, Google Plus will be a kind of orange-red. But if that kind of rainbow effect of that rainbow block effect is clashing with your design, if you think that clashes with your design a little bit too much, you want to kind of subdue it and choose some colors that look better with your website, well, then you have the control to do that here. So if you enable the Use Custom Colors, then you can start selecting from these 4 settings, which are background color, which is the background color of the button you see as soon as they appear, the hover background color, which is the background color of the button that appears as your mouse hovers over it, and the icon color, which also affects the text and the share count, which by default is white, but you can change that to something else. So for example, if you've adjusted your background color to be kind of a light gray, well then a white icon color is not going to show up very well, so you probably want to change that to a dark gray. And then the hover icon color, which is the color of the icon and the text that appears as you hover over the button with your mouse. So let me just enable some of these. I'm going to choose an orange background color and a red background hover color, and then I'm going to keep my icon colors white, since that's going to show up great on these dark oranges and reds. And refresh the page, and you can see I get now an orange background color with a red hover background color and the white text. Now if I go back and I let's say I change this to a light gray, and I don't think my icon color of white is going to show up very well in that light gray, well I might want to change this to black instead, or some other darker color. And as we refresh, you'll see that now we have the black text on the light gray. So you have full control over your icon colors and your background colors of those sharing buttons. Okay, the final setting here is the post type setting. And this is where you can control where on your website that Flyin appears. And you can do that on a post type basis, which means you can have your Flyin either appear or not appear on different post types. So by default, WordPress comes with 2 post types, which is posts and pages, but you may have additional post types. For example, if you're using Divi, the Divi theme, you might have the project post type, which is used for the portfolio. And if you're using WooCommerce, you might have the product post type. So here you can say, like, let's say you want your Flyin to only appear on products and nowhere else. So you're running an e-commerce site, you might have a bunch of products, and then you might have like an about page and a contact us page. You probably don't want people sharing your contact page. It's just not a very likely use case, but people very much might want to share your products, the products that they like the best. So you might want to enable the Flyin only on products, or you might want to just enable it on your homepage and your posts. If you're running like a publication, you probably definitely want to have sharing buttons on your posts. And like I said, less likely you'd want to have it on your pages, your contact page, or about us page. But here you can have full control of where that Flyin is placed on your website. And that is a basic overview of the Flyin sharing location for Monarch. In this tutorial, I'll be showing you how to use the pop-up location in Monarch. The Monarch pop-up is a lightbox modal window pop-up that includes sharing buttons, and this pop-up can be triggered based on various different triggers within the Monarch settings panel. So first off, let me just show you what the pop-up is. So I'm on a page here, and as I scroll down, this pop-up appears asking your visitors to share. So now let's go take a look at how to set up this pop-up. The first thing you're going to want to do is go to your WordPress dashboard and then go to Tools, Monarch Settings, and you're going to be brought to the Locations settings, and you're going to want to make sure that the pop-up location is enabled. So right now you can see the green check mark. That means I have it enabled. You can click it again to disable it, and if it's already disabled, then just click it to enable it. Make sure you have the green check mark there. So once the pop-up location has been enabled, we have to go ahead and configure that pop-up. So on the left, look for the pop-up tab. And then you're going to be brought to a list of settings where you can configure that pop-up. There's various settings here. You can choose your icon style, which is the hover animation. You can choose the shape. You can adjust the title or message that appears above the sharing buttons. You can choose various display settings such as icon alignment, adjust the columns. You can adjust the triggers. And getting down to the bottom here, we have some custom color settings, and then the post type settings, which is where you can control where the pop-up displays, and more specifically on which post types the pop-up displays, whether it be the post type or a page, or if you have custom post types such as the product post type that comes with WooCommerce or the project post type that comes with Divi, you can choose those as well. So let's start changing some of these settings just so I can show you what they do. So the icon style, that is the hover animation, and you can actually preview the hover animation right here in the settings panel. So just try each of these out and choose one that you like best. And I'm going to go with this nice flip animation. So select it, you get the green check mark, and that means you've enabled that animation style. Next up is the icon shape. Right now we have a rounded rectangle shape for the buttons. This affects the buttons within the pop-up, not the pop-up itself. So you can choose square, rounded rectangle, or circle. I'm going to keep it rounded rectangle for now. And then next up is the title and message. So you can input something here. Right now it says tell your friends, but you can say something else like please share our page. And so I'm going to save and then take a look at that. So scrolling down here, you can see the title has been adjusted to please share our page, and the animation has been changed to this flip animation here. So that's how the settings work. You just adjust the settings in the panel, and then you can go preview your pop-up to see what those do. So moving on to the display settings, there's quite a bit of display settings here, so I'm going to go over each one by one, starting with icon alignment. So Icon alignment adjusts where the icon is aligned within the button itself. So within each sharing button, each of them has an icon that represents the social website that it's going to lead to, and you can have that icon either be on the left or centered. So let's change it to centered and see what that looks like. I'm going to save, go back, refresh, scroll down here, and you can see now the icon has been centered along with the name and the share count of the network. Now, this setting in particular changes the height of the button quite a bit because everything becomes stacked. So this is a style you can play with if you want to make your buttons a bit bigger. In this case, since we only have 6 sharing locations here, the centered looks quite nice. But if you have quite a few sharing buttons, then the centered style might get a little too big, a little too overbearing for your visitors. So and it also depends on how much content you're having displayed within the button. So if you have the title and the share count disabled, then this stacking effect doesn't occur, and the height of the button won't be increased as much. So it's really just a personal preference, but in general, you probably don't want to use the centered style if you have a lot of buttons in your pop-up. Going back to the number of columns, this will affect the column layout, the column structure of your buttons. So you can see I have 3, which means there's a row of 3 buttons. And if I adjust that to 2, for example, it's going to become a row of 2 buttons. So instead of 3 by 2, it's going to become 2 by 3 since I have 6 buttons added right now. So just to show you what that looks like, I'm going to change it to 2, and I'm going to change this back to left. And we can refresh. And there we go. So now we have 2 columns of buttons, and our icons have been placed back on the left, which, as you can see, makes the buttons much smaller since the information is no longer being stacked. All right, next up, we have the intro animation. So this is the animation that appears as soon as the pop-up is displayed. By default, we should have a fade in, but there's lots of fun animations you can try, or you can just disable the animation entirely. So let's just test out one of these so I can show you. I'm going to choose the slide up instead of the fade in. And as you can see here, when we refresh, the pop-up is going to slide in from the bottom instead of just fading in. And if you want to get a little more crazy, you can try some of this other stuff like the Tada animation, which will definitely get your visitors' attention. So let me show you this one. There we go, Tada. Okay, so you can play with those animations and just choose whatever one you like best. Next up are our triggers. So the triggers you can use to trigger the pop-up based on different user actions. And so I'm going to go over each of these triggers, and you can use these in combination to get different effects, and you can play with these to see which ones actually results in more sharing activity on your page. So as for the triggers we have timing delay, an inactivity trigger, a trigger at the bottom of the post, a trigger after commenting, trigger after scrolling, and trigger after WooCommerce purchase. And we may be adding support for other e-commerce systems in the future. So the time delay, simply if you have the time delay trigger enabled, then that pop-up is going to trigger. It's going to pop up based on just the delay of time. So it's going to count down based on how many seconds you want. So if you enable the time delay and then you change your delay to 10 seconds, let's say, then as soon as someone visits your page and they've been on that page for 10 seconds, the pop-up will appear. So let's just show you that. I'm going to change it to 5 seconds. So I've enabled the time delay trigger. I've changed the delay to 5 seconds. I'm going to save and refresh. And if we just wait here for a few seconds, you'll see the pop-up will display. And there you go. Next up, we have the inactivity delay. So much like the timing delay, this pop-up will appear after a certain amount of time, but only when the user has been inactive for that amount of time. So for example, if your visitor has read your page, and then for some reason they clicked a link to a different page, and they left your tab inactive, and then they go to eat lunch and they come back and they've forgotten about your page, well, then this timing delay will make that pop up and try to re-grab their attention when they come back to your tab, and hopefully they'll be reminded to share. So I'm going to change this to 5 seconds and save. So we go back to our page, Let's say I'm scrolling around and reading the post. The pop-up isn't going to display while I'm active, which means it's also a little bit less annoying than the other pop-up. But as soon as I'm done reading and I stop interacting with the page, and that pop-up will display after 5 seconds, like that. The next is trigger at the bottom of the post. So it's pretty self-explanatory, and when this is enabled, the pop-up will display as soon as the reader has finished reading your post and reached the bottom of your post. This is actually one of my favorite triggers because it only engages those who are most engaged with your page, and it also only engages them once they're finished reading the post, which means you're not in danger of annoying them halfway through the post, which can be good or bad depending on how aggressive you want to get with these pop-ups and what kind of content you're displaying. So it's really up to you, and these triggers can be used in combination, and they can be used for different reasons depending on the content that you're using and the kind of results you're trying to get. So like I said, this will trigger at the bottom of the post, so you're reading the post and you get down to the bottom and it displays. Ask them to share. Next up is the trigger after commenting. This is also a really great one because it targets your not only engaged users, but your most engaged users, those users who have decided to comment on the post. So these people, they're obviously engaged with the post, they've gone as far as to comment in the post, and they are one of the most likely types of people to share your post. And so yeah, if they oops, I forgot to save. Trigger after commenting. So with this trigger, once they comment, they're going to be asked to share. So yeah, it's another great pop-up, and it's one that's not annoying at all. And like I said, it targets your most engaged users and can be used in combinations with the other triggers. So it's a nice one to have enabled. Okay, next up is the trigger after scrolling. So this is pretty similar to the trigger after commenting, which means you can use it to kind of trigger based on where they are on the page, but this gives you like a little bit more granular control. You can control exactly where on the page they are, how far down they have to scroll before that pop-up pops up. So this can be used, say you have a page with content that's kind of broken into certain categories, and you want that pop-up to display after they've read a certain part of the page, and you think, maybe after reading this part, they're going to be most engaged and most likely to share. Well, you can decide to display that pop-up, let's say 50% down the page, or 100% down the page, or whatever. Maybe you want to hit them right in the beginning, do 10% down the page, and so on. So this is the trigger after scrolling trigger. Enable that, and then you're going to get this second option here, which says % down the page, and you can decide how far down the page the user has to scroll before that pop-up appears, and by default it's 50%. So just to give you an idea of how that works, as soon as I scroll down 50% of the page, I'm going to get the pop-up. Okay, next up is the trigger after purchasing, and I'm not going to do a demo of this, but it's pretty self-explanatory, and that is after they make a purchase with WooCommerce, they're going to be asked to share your website, which is another time when you're hitting a person that's most engaged. They're not only engaged with your page, they're a fan of you and you're a fan of your product. They've just purchased your product, and they're very likely to share the fact that they purchased their product with their friends. So this is another great way to enable a social sharing pop-up that's not annoying at all and really hits your most targeted users. All right, next up is the display once per session option. So if you have, let's say you have the after time delay enabled, and this pop-up is going to pop up after 5 seconds on every single page you go to, every single post. Well, that might not be a big problem for the majority of your visitors who, let's say, are coming in through Google and reading one of your blog posts. Let's say you only have this pop-up enabled on the post type. Well, it's probably not that big of a deal, but if you're worried about these visitors exploring more deeply into your website and getting hit with this pop-up on every page, well, then you can enable this option, which will prevent the pop-up from displaying more than once per session. So every time they come to your website and they continue on to more pages, they're only going to get hit with a pop-up once. No matter how many triggers you have enabled, they're only going to see that pop-up once, and once they close it, they're never going to see it again until they leave your site and come back some other day. So you can enable this, display once per session, and you can choose the session duration. So let's say you only want this person to see one pop-up at most once per day, then you can put in 1 day here. Let's say you want to be, play it really safe and only want each person to see one pop-up once per week, then you can put in 7 days, and so on. Next is the display share counts. So this is the number that appears within the buttons that says how many times the post has been shared. So if you disable this, then that number is going to go away. So I'm going to disable that for you. And then take a look at what that pop-up looks like. So scrolling down here, you can see the numbers have been removed, and it just gives a bit of a cleaner look. And like I said, if you're using the centered style, then removing this will make your buttons a bit smaller. So if you want to use that centered style, but you don't want your buttons to be too big, you can start removing things like the share count. Also, if your pages don't have a lot of shares, you might not want to display share counts. Okay, so I'm going to put share counts back on. And the next up is the total shares. So this will tally up all the shares you have on a page and display a total share count. So if you enable that, then that total share count is going to be shown above your buttons. So you can see I've put the share count back on within the buttons. So obviously my page has not been shared. I'm just on localhost here, so I have a bunch of zeros. And then 0 times 6 is still 0, so I still have 0 shares total. But if I had a few shares on each of these networks, like 10 on Facebook, 10 on Google, and 10 on Twitter, then the total share count would be 30. Okay, so the All Networks button, this will display a button that, when clicked, will give the visitor the option to share on every single network that Monarch supports. So within this pop-up, let's say I only want to have a couple networks enabled, so you go over to our Networks tab, and I don't want to have all these, I only want to have a couple shown. I don't want to create this huge pop-up with 30 networks inside of it. I only want to have these 5. Well, then I can have these 5 enabled, but then I can enable the All Networks button, which will still give those visitors who click that the option to share on any network in a different pop-up. So go over to the pop-up options. I'm going to enable the Display All Networks button and save. So let's refresh the page, and you can see that I only have 5 networks enabled, but if they click this button to load more buttons, then they're going to get an option to share on every single network. So that's a great button to have. It doesn't take up too much space, but it still gives people the freedom to share on their favorite social network. Remove icon spacing. So this is purely a stylistic choice. If you'd like to remove the space between the buttons and kind of create this big colored, multicolored block of buttons instead, and it's a cool effect, and if you like it, then you can enable that. So I'll show you what it looks like here. I've now enabled remove icon spacing, which will remove the spacing between all the buttons. So you can see all that spacing has been removed, and it's kind of just a different style. So if you like this style, feel free to enable that. And finally, the hide on mobile devices option. If you think that pop-ups, which in particular might be maybe more annoying to visitors on mobile than it is on desktop, since it's a smaller screen, it's going to take up the whole screen. If you're at all worried about that, then you can choose to hide on mobile devices. It's also, I wouldn't worry too much about it being annoying, but if you have a bunch of different locations enabled, for example, let's say you have the sidebar enabled, you have the Flyin enabled, you have the pop-up enabled all at the same time. Well, on the desktop screen, there's plenty of space to kind of accommodate all those buttons, but on mobile, there's much less space, and since it's such a small screen, you really don't need to have all those enabled at once. You really just need one. In fact, usually the floating sidebars is plenty for mobile. So what I've done usually is enable the floating sidebar on everywhere, but hide the pop-up on mobile. So if you enable this, then that pop-up will only display when someone's on a desktop or a tablet. Okay. Next up are our color settings. So by default, the buttons assume the color of the network that they represent. So we've taken the color from these networks logos and applied those, and the most recognizable. But when you have a lot of buttons, it can certainly clash with your design. All this rainbow of colors. You might be going for a more simple look on your site, and so if you want to adjust these colors, you can. And so to do that, you want to select the Use Custom Colors option, and then you can adjust these 4 settings, which are background color, hover background color, icon color, and hover icon color. So the background color is the background color of the button that is displayed by default, and the hover background color is that's the background color that you will get when you hover over it with your mouse. So it'll fade to that second color. And likewise, you can choose the icon color, which also affects the text color and the count, and then the hover icon color, which will change the text color when you hover over it with your mouse. So let's say I want to go with an orange color on my site. I might change this to orange. You can also input the hex color yourself in here if you like. And say I want to make it red on hover. And then I probably just want the icon color to be white. But you can adjust that as well. So I'm going to save and refresh. So you can see now I have this orange color. On hover it goes to red. And because I've selected white for both the icon color and the icon hover color, those stay white by default and on hover. But you can adjust those as well. So let me show you that. Now let's say I want to go for a really more subdued kind of light blue color for my buttons. I can do that. And because I've gone with this lighter color, I probably don't want my icon color to be white. It's going to be hard to read, so instead I'll change it to black. And save. And you can see there, so it's gone to this light background color, and I've changed the icon color as well. Finally, we have our post type settings. This is where you choose where you want your pop-up to be displayed. And you can choose it on a post type basis. So by default, WordPress comes with two post types. You have the post, which is like your blog post, your articles, and you have your pages, which is your about page, contact page, etc. So if you want your sharing pop-up to only be displayed on posts, then you'd only want to select the post type. This is probably the most common way to set up the pop-ups because sharing is usually done for articles and not necessarily your contact page. But if you want to target your home page, on the other hand, you can do that separately from the rest of your pages. So if you just want your pop-up to display on your home page, you can select that. And also if you have custom post types with your theme or your plugins, you can adjust those as well. So in this case, I have WooCommerce installed. So if I want the sharing pop-up to be displayed on all my product pages, I can do that. And since I also have Divi installed, which comes with the project post type, if I want the pop-up to be displayed on all projects, I can enable that as well. In this tutorial, I will be talking about triggers, which are used to control how and where your Monarch pop-up and fly-ins are displayed on your website. For example, here is a pop-up being triggered on the post. As you can see, the trigger makes the pop-up display. And like I said, you can use different triggers to control how and when these pop-ups and fly-in boxes appear on your website. So first of all, to look at the trigger settings, we're going to go into our Monarch Settings page. So in the WordPress dashboard, go to Tools, Monarch Settings, and you're going to be greeted with the Locations tab first. As you can see, I only have the pop-up enabled right now. I'm going to go over the pop-up triggers, which are identical to the fly-in triggers, and then after that, we'll talk about how you can use the pop-ups and the fly-ins together with different triggers to yield great results. So first up, let's click on the pop-up tab here to reveal the settings related to the pop-up location. If you scroll down to display settings, you're going to get a list of all the triggers. Now we support 6 different triggers. The first one is trigger after time delay. The next is trigger after inactivity, trigger at the bottom of the post, trigger after commenting, trigger after scrolling, and finally trigger after purchasing. So I'm going to go over each of these in detail, and then after that talk about how to use them in combination as well. So all of these triggers can be used either alone, or you can use them all at once, or you can pick and choose. And so we'll go over that in a moment. First of all, let's enable the trigger after time delay. What this does is once someone hits your page, kind of an invisible countdown starts, and once that countdown reaches your specified delay value, then the pop-up is displayed. So for example, I'm going to set the delay value here to 5 seconds just for demo purposes, but you might want to adjust that accordingly. So let's just say someone has landed on your page, they started reading your post, they're engaged, they've been in your post reading it for a while, and so you know they're engaged, and therefore the pop-up is displayed after a certain amount of time. So for example, you might want to increase this value to something higher, such as 20 or 30 seconds, which means you're not necessarily annoying the visitor right off the bat, right? You don't really want to display that pop-up as soon as they hit the page. I mean, they haven't even had time to enjoy your post or figure out what your post is about, and so they're certainly not ready to share it if they don't even understand it yet. So the trigger after time delay, the delay value should be chosen with care. And like I said, I recommend a higher value, maybe 20 or 30 seconds, however long you think it takes for a user to be engaged with your page or your post, depending on the kind of content you have on your website. But for demonstration purposes, and so I don't have to wait here for 30 seconds, I'm going to use a delay value of 5 seconds just to show you what it does. So going back over to our test post here, I'm going to refresh the page and wait for 5 seconds, and you'll see that the pop-up is displayed once that delay value is reached. And there you go. So like I said, you can play with that delay value and find something that works for you. Now next up, I'm going to disable the time delay and move on to the inactivity delay. So the inactivity delay works much like the time delay, except that invisible countdown timer only starts counting down once your visitor becomes idle, once he becomes inactive. And so let's say someone lands on your post and they read it, they got to the end, and then they got distracted, they had to leave their desk, and you've kind of lost their attention, right? You lost that chance to get the share. Well, in this case, once we detect that that visitor has become inactive, then we inactive for a specified amount of seconds that you choose, then we display the pop-up. And when the visitor comes back to the page, we hope that they get re-engaged from that pop-up. Okay, so I'm going to enable trigger after inactivity, and then you can adjust the idle timeout value, which in this case I'm going to leave to 5 seconds, but you might want to make that more, just to be completely sure that your visitor is actually idle and not just kind of sitting there reading a paragraph. In that case, you don't really want to disrupt their reading. Okay, so I've enabled inactivity delay, and I'm moving around, I'm scrolling. The pop-up isn't going to display while I'm active, but once I become inactive, someone rang the doorbell or whatever, I'm going to sit here for our timeout value of 5 seconds of inactivity, and as you can see, the pop-up is displayed. And once I come back, well, I just might share if since I have been invited to do so. Okay, next up, we have the trigger at the bottom of post trigger, which is one of my favorite triggers and something I recommend almost everyone enabling because it very specifically targets your most engaged visitors and therefore the visitors that are most likely to share your post, which are those visitors who have read your entire post and probably enjoyed it if they have gotten to the end of it. And another bonus of this is that you're not disrupting anyone during the reading, and you're also avoiding annoying visitors who are just landed on your page. So you can think of this as a more targeted triggering mechanism. It's going to result in less frustration for your visitors, although it is only going to be triggered for a smaller portion of your visitors. So it may actually result in less overall shares, but like I said, the conversion rate of the pop-up is going to be much increased. So the time delay is kind of like a Hail Mary. You're showing it to everyone, and you're kind of getting the most visitors the most shares you can out of all your visitors, but at the cost of potentially causing some annoyance to your most faithful visitors, those who are reading your posts every day and trying to enjoy the full post. So, like I said, it's really up to you which triggers you want to enable, but I really recommend this one. So let me show you how it works. I'm going to save this and refresh our page. And as I scroll down and reach the bottom, I get invited to share. So yeah, it's a great trigger, and it usually works quite well. Next is the trigger after commenting, which, much like the trigger at the bottom of the post, is geared to engaging those visitors who are most engaged with your content. And so this is even a step above the bottom of the post. Not only have they reached the bottom of the post and enjoyed your post, they've gone as far as to interact with the post by commenting. So these people who have commented on your post, they have taken part in the conversation, taken part in the post itself, and are therefore very likely to want to share that post with their friends. Not only to share the post, but perhaps to share their comment and share their opinion. And so the way this works is if someone has commented on the post, as soon as the page refreshes, they get asked to share the post. So I'm going to show you how that works. Refresh the page here. So you scroll down, you make a post. Submit the post, and boom, you get asked to share. So like I said, this converts really well, and it's also something that I recommend to just about anyone using the plugin. Next up is the trigger after scrolling, and the way this works is much like the trigger at the bottom of the post, except instead of us choosing the point at which the pop-up is displayed as you scroll, this lets you choose exactly where the pop-up is triggered based on a percentage. So once you enable trigger after scrolling, you can choose at which percent down the page the pop-up is displayed. So depending on the kind of content you have, you might have a specific page where this pop-up is being displayed, and there might be a specific point within the content of that page that you think visitors are most likely to share. Or maybe you want to, just for whatever reason, maybe you want to hit people at the very, very bottom of your page, or maybe you want to get them engaged at the beginning of the page. This is a great way to do that. So right now I've enabled trigger after scrolling, and then you can choose the percent down the page you'd like to use. I have it set to 50% down the page. And so let me show you how that works. And as you scroll down the page and reach 50%, the pop-up is going to show up. Next up is the trigger after purchasing, and this is also a really great way, much like the commenting one, to target those visitors who are most engaged. And in this case, they've actually purchased a product, so they're a fan of your brand, they're a fan of the product, and they are very likely to want to share that product or your brand with their friends. So the way this works is if they've purchased a product using WooCommerce, and right now we support WooCommerce, but we'll be adding more support for more e-commerce systems in the future. So if you scroll down below this video, we'll have some more information about the currently supported e-commerce systems. Anyways, if they make a product purchase, once they reach the thank you page, not only will they be thanked for purchasing, they'll also be encouraged to share the fact that they purchased, share the homepage of the website with their friends. Okay, so after they purchase, the pop-up is displayed, and I'm not going to go through the purchasing process for you right now, so it's pretty self-explanatory. That's how that works. All right, so those are the 6 triggers, and what we haven't covered yet is how they can be used together. So just an example, let's say you want to engage both your most engaged visitors, but also try to recapture your least engaged visitors. So in this case, the users who have gone inactive, those are kind of visitors you've lost their attention, and you want to kind of hit them with one more punch and hope to re-grab their attention. That's the inactivity trigger, so you might want to enable that. And in addition, you want to engage with your most engaged visitors, which would be those who have commented and those who have purchased. So in this case, you're kind of hitting both ends of the spectrum, right? Someone who lands on your page and reads the post, gets halfway through, or gets to the bottom and then leaves and comes back. You're asking them to share, trying to get them re-engaged with the post. And also, if they've commented, you're engaging those visitors as well. But what you're not doing is kind of hitting every single visitor that lands on your page with a pop-up on every single page, which could possibly get annoying. Another way you might want to do it is, like I said, you can just enable all of them. If you really want to do all you can to get more shares, you can enable all of them. And even though this may seem like it's a little too much, like it's going to become too annoying, it actually isn't. So the way we've set up Monarch is that during each page view, the pop-up will only be displayed once. So if you have all these triggers enabled, the first trigger to enable the pop-up will be the only trigger that actually comes into effect for that page view. So it's not like they land on the page and 5 seconds into the post they get hit with a pop-up. due to the time delay, and as they scroll down 50% of the page, they get hit with another one due to the scroll trigger, and when they get to the bottom of the post, they get hit with the trigger at the bottom of the post, and then after they comment, they get hit again. No, that's not how it's going to work. Instead, this is kind of just ensuring that no matter what, the most amount of visitors will see the pop-up, and obviously if you have all 6 of these triggers enabled, you're going to end up getting the most shares possible, but at the expense of knowing that every single visitor is going to see that pop-up, and if your content isn't compelling enough, well, that pop-up just might be a deterrent for that visitor. So like I said, the idea here is to have great content and to encourage your visitors to share that great content. So there's nothing wrong with enabling a bunch of triggers if you have content that people love and want to share. So like I said, you can use all these triggers together. You can pick and choose certain triggers to kind of hit different visitors that fall on different ends of the spectrum of engagement level, or you can just enable one of them that kind of is like a blanket effect, like the trigger after time delay. Okay, and in addition to kind of combining triggers within the pop-up itself, you can also kind of combine triggers with the Flyin as well, and kind of create this system of Flyins and pop-ups being used in different situations. So just to give you an example of what I've done on our blog, is I've kind of combined the Flyin and the pop-up, and I've used the Flyin with a time delay, so that almost every single visitor that's even a little bit engaged with our posts, so they've been on the post long enough to read something, they get shown the Flyin, which doesn't obstruct their reading of the post. So that's one important thing. The Flyin will not obstruct the reading of the post, which means it's a great candidate for the trigger after time delay. So you could combine a Flyin with a time delay trigger and use the pop-up after reaching the bottom of the post. So that's a great way to kind of combine the Flyin and the pop-up using 2 different triggers, kind of understanding how the trigger, how the pop-up versus the Flyin affects the reading ability of the visitor on the page. So I'll go over that real quick. So I'm going to go back to our locations and enable the Flyin. We have both the Flyin and the pop-up enabled. So I'm going to go over to our Flyin settings, and I'm going to enable the trigger after time delay and disable the rest. So now the Flyin is going to be displayed after 5 seconds. And in addition, the pop-up will be displayed after commenting. So let me save those changes and go back to our post here and refresh. So now they've landed on the page. They've begun reading, and as they read, they get this little Flyin that goes, oh, it reminds them that as they're reading, oh, I might want to share this when I'm done. And so they close that. That's too bad. The first trigger might have failed in this situation, but that doesn't mean all is lost, because after they comment, they get reminded one more time with the pop-up. And so this is a great way to kind of combine 2 different locations using 2 different triggers, but not having them kind of like overlap and kind of compete with themselves during the reading of the post. And so yes, you can use these triggers creatively and in combination with each other. And yeah, so that's a basic overview of using triggers with Monarch.